Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. If you're in the United States, if you're in Europe, if you're in Latin America, if you're in Africa or in any part of India or Asia, but welcome to this special conversation with the Huntsman Business School at Utah State University. The Stephen Covey Center for Leadership is hosting a conversation where we're talking about leaders, leadership, inclusion, and diversity. And there couldn't be a more important moment to have this conversation, not just because of electoral events in different parts of the world, but because of the restraints so many people are living under and looking to leaders, whether medical or political, scientific or business, to find solutions. We're all looking to leaders and needing leaders and asking, where have they gone? So in this conversation between some phenomenally significant people with careers that have spanned great decades in their lives, but also with thoughtful perspectives on leadership, inclusion, and diversity. I'm going to ask each one of them to give us a short perspective on what they've been thinking of, and then we're going to have some opening questions. So I'm going to turn, first of all, if I may, to Ann Chow. She is in Texas at the moment. She's with AT&T, CEO of AT&T Business, and leadership is on the end of your tongue all the time. How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, so thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with this distinguished group of leaders. So a couple of things are on my mind as my team and I have responsibility for serving millions of business customers all around the world of all different shapes and sizes across industries. And what strikes me is that there's never been a time where leadership has been paramount in all facets of our life. In fact, I believe that leadership is not about a title. There's no one who is born a leader. You don't learn to be a leader. You actually choose to be a leader. And I think this is so prevalent at this moment in time because we are faced with three major crises, right? Namely the global pandemic, the global economic recession, as well as in areas of the country, including the United States, systemic racism and social injustice. And there's never been a confluence of the intersection of what is needed across the public sector, across the private sector, across nonprofits, and across our community at large. And so for me, leadership is paramount. It is paramount to ensure that every community is able to thrive. It is paramount to ensure that every business can be successful. And it is paramount to ensure that we as the human race on this one singular planet in which we inhabit can continue to thrive and be prosperous. And unfortunately, Michael, we're at a point where we're quite a bit far from that, right? And I suspect that we together as a colleague-ship here will explore this topic even greater. But that is what is very much on my mind these days about leadership.
Thank you, Anne, for that very honest and realistic perspective. I'm going to turn to James Manyika. He's in San Francisco. He's chairman of the McKinsey's Global Institute and the senior partner of McKinsey's San Francisco office. James, what's on your mind?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to be part of this. Issues of inclusion and diversity have been very much on my mind, and partly as a result of some of the work that I do. So I spend a fair amount of time thinking about how economies are doing, but also how businesses are doing. And if you take a view, at least from an economic standpoint, the 21st century so far has been pretty interesting. I think generally things have gone well economically, despite the recession 2008, and also now the situation we're in, we've seen employment go up. But if you look at that wonderful story of the 21st century so far, it's been very uneven. And so if you were in those first 20 years, if you were highly educated and high wage earner and probably white and probably male, you actually did very well. If you are not any of those things, it hasn't been so well. So for example, if you look at middle skilled workers, and we've looked at this across many of the advanced countries, they've been squeezed. If you look at low income individuals, they've also experienced quite tough outcomes. If you look at people who live in particular geographies, even inside the United States, I think people don't realize that, for example, all the job growth we've been celebrating in the US in the last several years has mostly 2/3 of it has come out of about 1/3 of the counties in the United States. If you're in other parts of the country, you've not really been part of it. So the lack of inclusion geographically has been quite real. And then if you look at women in particular, they still continue to get paid less than men. Career opportunities are not what they should be for the wider population. And then if you look at minorities, it's even worse. Let me just give you a couple of factoids when you look at what it looks like if you're Black and brown. We know that, for example, the wealth of the median white family is 10 times that of the median Black family, and about 7.5 times that of the median Hispanic family. We know that, for example, Black American families are more likely than white families to be in debt, and also their students to be in debt at twice the rate. We know that even before COVID, Black workers were unemployed at twice the rate of white workers. And we also know that, for example, 45% of Black American children attend high poverty schools versus, and that's at 6 times the rate of what it is for white children. And you can go on and on and on with these kinds of statistics, Michael. So you certainly realize that economically, this has not been very inclusive for minorities, for women. And COVID has also made this vastly worse, by the way, and exposed some of these inequities. But what I should say is when you then also look at companies, and I spend a lot of time with CEOs and executives, you also see that in companies, it's not a pretty picture either. While companies may have made progress, at least in terms of recruiting, when you look at progression and development all the way to the C-suite, it looks very uneven for women, and it looks even more uneven for minorities, especially Black and brown leaders. So these issues of lack of inclusion, both in the economy broadly and in companies and businesses, have been very much on my mind.
Thank you, James. And that was a real tour de force of information and facts, and very helpful to put it into sharp perspective. So I'm going to turn now to Sanda Ojiambo, and Sanda is in New York. She is the chief executive of the United Nations Global Compact, the largest network of global businesses committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. And she has come fresh to New York from Nairobi in Kenya, where she was in charge of corporate affairs at Safaricom, which is one of Africa's greatest telecoms companies. Sanda, what's on your mind on leadership?
Thank you, Michael, and great to be with all the distinguished panelists. The first thing when you talked about this question was, what a simple yet complex question. Something that is the subject of lots of books, lots of inquiry, lots of courses all around the world. And people try to teach or explain or answer that question with kids as young as, I think, 5-year-olds till folks as old as we are and even older. Simple yet complex. That's really what's on my mind. But another thing that's on my mind at a very personal level is that I think this is probably the moment in my life most when I've looked for leadership and looked for leadership to help make sound decisions, to guide through all of the unprecedented times and things that have been happening over the last 6 to 8 months. And I imagine around the world, millions are looking for leadership to guide through all of this. It made me also think about followership. Because leadership has to come with followership. And what does followership mean? And what kind of followers are we all as we go through these complex times and navigate this? But if I bring it home to some of the work that we do at the Global Compact, because we look to have leaders who are bold, moral, courageous leaders driving forward sustainable and responsible business, an interesting statistic from one of our studies is, whereas this is technically, part of the attributes of, forward-looking CEOs, a study found that very few job descriptions actually model what those leadership attributes should be when you come to what's on paper, what's contracted, and what you actually measure. So it made me think that, there's probably a little bit more work to be done in terms of translating ideals around leadership and making them real. Such that when you sit down to get evaluated as a leader, how concrete and how tangible do you make that? Those are my thoughts.
Sanda, thank you. Thank you very much for that wise perspective. And on behalf of the Huntsman Business School. Welcome to the United States. So can I turn to Boyd Craig? And Boyd Craig is Professor of Leadership at the Stephen Covey Institute, Huntsman Business School. He's also the Director General of Leader.org and has worked closely, as he did for many, many years, with Stephen Covey in the writing of his books and in the building of the work that Stephen Covey did so effectively. Boyd, you're a leader all the time. What's on the end of your mind?
Thank you so much. First, let me begin by saying what a delight and honor it is to be with you, Michael, and with you, Anne, and James, and Sanda. It's an honor, and to be gathered in this subject, so timely and important. And I also think that it's not an insignificant thing that we're gathered and convened under the banner of this Stephen R. Covey Leadership Center, which is connected to the name of Stephen R. Covey. You know, you mentioned, Michael, that I spent many years working closely with Stephen, and his life was dedicated to this idea that you mentioned, Anne, that leadership is a choice, not a position, and that sustained impact in leadership is inseparable from universal, timeless, self-evident principles. And the mission of this leadership center at Utah State acknowledges that the greatest need in the world today is for leadership. And that the real focus is developing principle-centered leaders of character and competence who will elevate all of society. I'm personally inspired by that aspiration. And in terms of what's on my mind, it doesn't escape me that a large segment of our audience in this session today is young people, college-age people. And the thing I think about most in my professional career and my work at the university is on our future, and our future through the lens of children and young people. And what can we do? What must we do to prepare them to be equal to what will face them? And so to you, young people in the audience, let me just speak for all of us to say, we love you and we believe in you and we're counting on you. You're our future and we're confident in you. And we're devoted to our future through you. Another thing that I want to share is earlier this year, I watched a speech given by David Brooks, the political commentator. And in this speech, he said this: many of society's greatest problems flow from people not feeling seen and known. There is a core trait that we all have to get better at, and that is the trait of seeing each other deeply and being deeply seen. So in terms of this subject that we're addressing of diversity and inclusion and all the turmoil in society, I think it's important that each one of us realize that at the core of it is how we see people, and how we treat them flows out of how we see them. Related to that, I would say also that in facing any possible solution to this challenge we face in this century, we have to remember that every significant public victory that we seek is preceded by an equally significant private victory. It comes out of our own heart and our own mind and our own spirit. And so, you know, my opening invitation is that with all these insights we try to share, that we're examining our own heart first and have that become the solution. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Boyd. Now I'm going to ask each one of our panel to really focus in on who inspires them as a leader. It's easy to talk about the principles of leadership. That's very important. But when we think about the reality of the world that we're in right now, 2020, not historically way back then, if I go to you first of all, Sanda, and say to you, who do you look to, or who did you recently look to as a really significant leader, and why would you, in a sentence, why would you have done that?
Right, and I'll speak about, you know, my former CEO, a gentleman I think a few of you have met, Bob Collymore. He was the former CEO of Safaricom. And I'm going to pull off what Boyd said about people wanting to be seen, and you know, that being a root cause of a lot of the, you know, the challenges we see today. You know, Bob joined us displaying probably not all of the usual attributes of a leader. He had no, and this was for a significant commercial company, he had no university degree, had no commercial acumen, you know, at that point in time wore the most ridiculously colored socks and ties and was full of his own personal swag, as we used to call it. But Bob firmly believed this quote from one of Dr. Seuss's books, which was, "A person is a person no matter how small." That was probably one of his most favorite quotes from a children's book. And I think it just reflected what we're saying about people wanting to be seen and be respected. And, you know, I think for me, Bob represented authenticity more than anything else, represented inclusion, represented the deep respect for the fact that leadership was not about titles, designation, and all of those things. It was really about your social influence and how inclusive you could be, and how transformative and visionary you could be. So for me, Bob was someone who embodied a lot of the things that I hold near and dear today.
Thank you. He was a wonderful man. I had the joy of being around him a number of times, both in New York and in Kenya. So thank you for pointing that out. And James, turning to you, when you think of a leader who kind of gets you, that you really look up to, you want to put forward, who would that be?
Well, Michael, I find myself inspired by so many different leaders. Let me put a couple categories. So I'm inspired by those who've stood up for their communities. And we've seen numerous examples of that. You could look to the Black Lives Matter movement and others who stood up for their communities and said, you know, this is difficult for us. Second, I've been extraordinarily inspired by leaders who've gone against the grain. One of the things that's happened, at least in my world, you know, if you think about large companies, it's been quite striking how the Business Roundtable, which represents some of the largest companies in the United States, have actually gone out and put out a statement to say, we're going to think differently about how our businesses and the economies work. You know, your CEO, Anne, and a few others are part of that group, have said, no, we're going to take a multi-stakeholder view to how we think about things. That's been inspiring. I've also been inspired by people who've been doing pioneering work. There's been an extraordinary amount of scientific work that's needed to be done in this moment to develop vaccines, therapies at breakneck speed. I think so the power of science and innovation to do pioneering work that's necessary has been extraordinary. And then finally, people who stood up and spoken truth to power. It's one of the toughest things to do, which is to stand up and speak truth to power at a time when there could be so much backlash and so forth. So these are the kinds of leaders who've inspired me, Michael.
Wonderful, thank you. And when you think about a leader, where does your mind go?
Yeah, I mean, you'll hear some similar themes here, and you know, what I'm going to share with you may a little bit be cliche, but you know, I would share with you the anchor for me around leadership has always been my parents. And you'll hear some similar themes to what Sanda and James were sharing about characteristics. So my parents were immigrants to the United States. They came here in the 1960s with less than $500 US to their name. My father was the first to go to college in his family, and he came to the United States for grad school. They came to a country where they did not know the language. They knew no one, and they took a massive risk because they were able to leap forward on the belief that hope could live in a different place than where they grew up. And so those are huge characteristics of leadership that sit with me today. In addition to that, as immigrants to this great country, they always believed that you could persevere, that if you had a dream big enough and you were willing to put the work in and you were willing to do the right things with and in support of the right people, that you could find your own greatness and that you could be successful on whatever realm that you desire to be. And so that sticks with me today in terms of their fundamental belief in a place, an environment, and the journey and the mission of always striving to be your best. And by the way, being your best may not necessarily be being the best, but as long as you were after your fullest potential in every way, shape, or form, that was a great destination for anybody to aspire to live their life. And what I would also say is that, you know, in my parents, I learned from them not only this notion of risk-taking and hope and perseverance and grit. But this responsibility, they have always felt that there were so many people, and this is so true, I think, for every single one of us, who have helped us each on our own individual journeys. And it is completely impossible for us to go look back and pay back every single person. And so therefore, the only thing we can do as leaders is pay it forward. And so my parents have always instilled in me that you must always be good, but you absolutely must do good. Right. And by the way, my mother also said you need to look good sometimes too. But you can't just be good or look good. You must always do good. And these are some guiding tenets of leadership that to this day I carry with me. They're a big part of my leadership mantra and what I hope to pay it forward. And that's what I think about and whom I think about when I think about great leadership.
Thank you. Thank you. And Boyd.
Thank you, Michael. As I was just thinking about this, a business leader came to my mind. And in the late 90s, Stephen Covey and I met with Horst Schulze, the co-founder and former president, COO of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company. And his company had just won the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award for the second time. I think the only in the service category to ever do that. And we met with him in one of his properties in Atlanta. And we were asking him to reflect on this honor that's come to him. The first thing he said was, Boyd and Stephen, we're the best, but we're not even good. And this deep inner passion and commitment for excellence and for instilling this service mindset into the heart of the culture. What we've also discovered is that there's something right at the core of those achievements, and it's in their credo. For many organizations, if not most, their mission statement is really just something framed on the wall. We all aspire to get it more deeply ingrained inside of us. But their credo is this: we are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. And so it didn't just start with, this commitment to serve. It really started with a view of the value and dignity of every person. And if you've ever been in a Ritz-Carlton hotel, you know that this happens right down at the frontline level. And so one of the best things you can ever do is get in a conversation with one of their housekeepers or one of the bellmen. And if you want to test the culture, throw them a challenge. There's no better place to throw a challenge to than one of them, because they spend most of their effort training and developing this whole mindset of we are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. And all their training is with the idea that we empower our frontline people with the judgment to provide the highest level of service to every person. And so even a housekeeper is empowered with a decision-making ability of comping $2,000 to any guest to solve a problem. Of course, you'd run out of business if that were done every day. But the point is they have a judgment, and deep within them, they have this sense of their own worth and potential and this deep respect for every person that they seek to serve. And so I point to this scene that, this really flowed out of a deep, passionate mindset on the part of a leader. But to me, the greatest manifestation of this kind of leadership is the way it shows up right at the front line. And this becomes a deep source of passion and really remarkable outcomes at every level of the organization. So this is one business person I've come to admire greatly, not only because of his character and competence, because of the outcome throughout the whole organization.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to put my own person into the pot, and I am a great and continuing fan of Angela Merkel. 2021 will possibly be her final year as Chancellor of Germany. She's done a remarkable job in supporting not just the reintegration of the ongoing strong German economy and its people, but the hard decision that she made some years ago to accept into Germany over 1 million migrants coming out of the Syrian crisis was a challenge of leadership which no other country was willing to take at that pace and space. I came across a very interesting reflection on Angela Merkel just a week ago when a press reporter came up to her and said, "I took a picture of you in the same dress 10 years ago." And she responded, "I have a mission to serve the German people, not to be a model." And I am very impressed by a person who Time magazine said, "You never hear from the front, but she leads from behind." And that's the characteristics of a strong person whose moral dignity and political and personal philosophical acumen has enabled her to contain and to grow a country with such significance in the modern era. And in all of that, never to go out there as a celebrity. So moving on in our thoughts, now we're facing such massive change in the world ahead of us. As we look forward to the decades ahead, the population prediction by the United Nations by 2100 is that around 2 billion people in the world will either be Indian or Nigerian, and that will be a surprise to many. Nigeria becoming the second most populous country on the planet with nearly 800 million people. So in other words, the world is becoming increasingly brown and black. Even the United States will find within a few short decades that 50% of the US is Hispanic and African American. So that means that countries and cultures have got to change. And when you think about preparing for that change, James, if I come to you first, how would you encourage leaders to prepare for such or what looks like the need to have an inclusive future?
Well, I think that that's such a profound question, Michael, particularly when you look at what's going on around the world. And this goes back to the questions of leadership. To me, part of the preparation and also a trait, I think, for leaders in that 21st century is to also understand and embrace our collective challenges that are going to span countries and regions. So just to give a few examples of what I think of as global collective challenges that leadership is going to need to rise up to. One is just inequality and poverty. There's just so many differences globally on these issues. And in fact, you mentioned migration and Angela Merkel and Syrian refugees. The bigger part of movement in the world is actually mostly for economic reasons, economic migration. So these issues of inequality and poverty globally, I think are going to need to be thought about in a collective way. The other one is also what we're living through right now, another collective challenge is health and pandemics. This isn't the last pandemic we're going to live through. There are going to be many more in the future. And these are collective challenges that know no country boundaries, as we know. And so we have to embrace and understand that collective challenge. The other big one, and it may be the biggest one, is climate change. This is a challenge for the whole world. And in fact, when you mentioned Nigeria and India, one of the things that's interesting about Nigeria and India, and especially India, for example, is that even as the earth warms just a little bit, places like India, half the population typically works outside. And so these questions of livability and workability for some of these largest countries, when the effects of climate change kick in, are going to be extraordinary. So I would like our leaders to think about these global collective challenges and to collectively think about how we prepare for them. So these are some of the things that I think are going to be quite important, Michael.
Sanda, how are you encouraging the CEOs and the leaders of the UN to think about this very, very strange and different future?
Yeah, and it's a really it's a deep question that calls for a lot of reflection. But I think in our view, for those who would be fearful of this kind of change, or for those who are accustomed to privilege, I think the key thing is that the shift has to happen. There's nothing to be fearful about what these people are. It's humanity. And I think we need to shift leadership to think about and to appreciate that we do all we do in service of humanity. And really, that's where we focus our leadership track within the Global Compact. It's really about moral leadership. It's leadership that is willing to make tough decisions to drive sustainable and inclusive business as we go forward. And I certainly do think, as you say, the demographic shift and how businesses actually shift to accommodate that is very important. If you're to take a core business look at it, these are customers. My fundamental question would be, how are you going to shift your business to address the growing business needs of these diverse populations? But I want to overlay with something else, which is not only this geographic demographic that you talk about, Michael, but the youth. I think in the future, there's going to be a huge youth population. And I think that is also a massive challenge for traditional leadership that perhaps hasn't really thought about inclusivity from that perspective. I think that that's going to be a massive challenge for how businesses shape themselves, how businesses get young people into their business, into their businesses and into their offices, and thirdly, how businesses serve an increasing demographic of young people as well.
Boyd?
Thank you. I'd say in a word, listen. I think one of the most important things leaders can do is focus on increasing the individual and institutional capacity to listen and be aware of the needs and wants of these emerging populations and even around them. I remember once visiting with Muhammad Yunus, the founder of the global microcredit movement and founder of the Grameen Bank. Many of you may be familiar with his story of how he got started. We asked him, how did this vision, this microcredit vision, this massive movement to reduce poverty in the world come to you? He said, I had no vision to begin with. He said, in fact, if I were to compare myself, I wouldn't be some eagle way up in the sky with some grand vision. I'd be a worm. In other words, I paid attention to a need right in front of my nose. A woman in poverty who is enslaved to this poverty for the lack of $2 to release herself from the bondage of being dependent on the traders to get her funding for her materials. He said, all I did is saw someone in need and then tried to fill that need. And then the vision emerged.
And Anne, how do you think we should prepare our world for this massive demographic change?
Yeah, I think about this in a couple of ways. First of all, I think leaders need to realize that when we are in a time of crisis, as we've said, we are clearly now, that what crises do to people is they have the human behavior is such to become even more fearful, right? To even have your guard up even more, and to be very, very uncertain about things. And what leaders must do is help people work through that fear courageously and to acknowledge it. What happens too here, and this is why the notion of diverse leadership, inclusive leadership becomes so vital for us, because we are at this point in time with major crises, with the convergence of demographic shifting, even beyond the quote unquote racial or ethnic or cultural diversity that is happening. There is, as Sandra said, the generational diversity, which then brings on even questions and opportunities for a broader understanding of gender, gender identity. One fact that always sticks with me, because I think it is a reflection of how we as leaders must think and behave and act and engage in an even more inclusive way, is that Generation Z, which is the generation of students now in college. I happen to have two Gen Z college-age daughters. 25% of Gen Z will question their gender identity throughout their lifetime or change their gender identity, right? So something as simple as how you address a population, or how you address a group, or how you engage your client base, or how you recruit for your workforce. These are all so many facets of dimensions of what leaders now must do and be sensitive to widen their aperture of understanding. And as Boyd said, this starts with listening. It starts with an open mind and an open heart, and the realization that there is not one person on this earth who knows everything, right? And so to be able to deal with uncertainty and fear and humility with great courage and forward-looking is what I think is so required. And I believe that leaders must not only be compassionate, but they must lead empathetically, right? Which is not just simply about, hey, I understand, or I appreciate, or I feel for how you are feeling or your perspective, but I will work hard to understand and engage and attempt to walk a mile in your shoes and have you teach me what that means. And I find that to be true as businesses now look to transform themselves, because what crisis also brings is this imperative to transform yourself again, to find prosperity again, to help contribute, to greaten your impact. And Michael, those are many of the things that are on my mind when I think about what leaders must do going forward.
So let's go to the really hard guts of inclusion and diversity, especially when we're thinking about the pressures that lack of racial inclusion have evidenced across the United States, across Europe, and of course, consistently around many countries of the world. So many communities feeling alienated. And you've got a book, Anne, coming out in a month's time, The Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias. We all look forward to that in November. But give us some of the lessons you're picking out there on handling racial distinctiveness and the need for inclusion. Just give us a few of those lessons.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, and I appreciate the unsolicited plug for the book, Michael, that I was so lucky to co-author with Pamela Fuller and Mark Murphy from Franklin Covey. So the whole tenet of the book is really around unconscious bias, right? And I believe that the topic of bias, and very specifically unconscious bias, is perhaps the most important topic that we must surface in order for us to move forward as a society, as humanity. And it is not just simply about racial bias, right, which is not actually the intent of the book. The book is really to address the topic of unconscious bias as a whole, but to realize that bias is a natural part of the human condition, right? And we all have biases. One of the biggest takeaways that I would want for people to realize as they work through the book, which is a very practical guide, by the way, as you would expect from Franklin Covey, is that we all have bias, right? And we must learn how to reframe bias. This is not about ignoring bias or suppressing bias or denying bias, because I would actually offer that where fear comes from, and when we think about dissent in any aspect of society, political dissent, religious dissent, generational dissent, it largely comes from a place of bias, right? And that bias is either conscious or unconscious, and there are many different flavors of it. And so in order for us to move forward, we must address this topic of unconscious bias, of which there are many different types of it, but that we each have it as individuals. And so until we are able to address it and understand it and work to reframe it within ourselves, we will not be able to help others work through it, whether it's our teams, our organizations, our community, or our society at large. And so those are some of the thoughts that I would have around the lessons in the book. And it is really about cultivating connection after you kind of learn how to reframe that bias in yourself and in others in a constructive way. You do so through the cultivation of connection, which is something that we all desire for us to come together to work through these crises and to contribute much more greatly to society. And it is about creating high-performing teams. The book is really specifically addressed to leaders in the context of a workplace, but to where I started in my introduction, leaders are needed everywhere, and leaders are in fact everywhere in every aspect of society. And so this topic of bias, you can correlate the workplace lessons and tools into any environment, whether it's in a school, in a classroom, in a church, in your family, in your social group. And those are some of our hopes and takeaways and lessons that I hope our readers will find helpful.
Thank you. Sanda, you come from a dominantly African Black country into a country that is mixed, African American, Hispanic, white, European background, and many others. As you think about unconscious bias and about rooting out racial bias, what do you feel in your gut has got to be the right way to deal with this?
And I want to reflect on this as I wait to read Anne's book. Allow me to cite from another book that I recently read, and we had a work session in my team, The Global Compact, which is a book by Ibram Kendi about how to be an anti-racist. And what he talks about is that you're either racist or you're anti-racist. There's nothing in between. There's no gray zone and there's no comfort zone. And it truly made us all reflect. We went through a period of actually internal self-reflection, myself and the leadership team, and then worked with the whole team to really figure out that, either you are something or you're not. And, and you have to stand up, speak out, take firm action, and challenge positions, challenge yourself, challenge your orthodoxies. And I think this ongoing reflection, as Anne says, around your unconscious biases is always a true awakening. But I just want to reflect on that book, because it really made me think about something perhaps in a way that I hadn't. Either you're racist or you're anti-racist. So choose one, and hopefully choose the right one, and just stand for it and get out there and take some action. I thought it was an absolutely amazing read. As I said, as I wait for Anne's book too.
James, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I was going to jump in and pick up on something that Anne said, and also I think Boyd mentioned this earlier. I think this notion of connection is actually quite important, and the idea of listening and trying to, as much as possible, walk in other people's shoes. But I would also add maybe another word, which is proximity. One of the things that's interesting about proximity, if we think about all the diversity that exists, whether it's gender, race, and all these different ways that we're all diverse, much of that diversity is easy to overcome when there's enormous proximity and engagement. So think about diversity in your own family. There are males and females. That immediate relational proximity, I think, actually helps. But often when it comes to issues of race, there are fewer instances for that relational proximity. So how many people actually have a Black friend, a really intimate Black friend? I don't mean a workmate, I mean an actual Black friend. The numbers get very, very small very, very quickly. So you suddenly realize that, this question of proximity and being able to actually understand the other side becomes very, very difficult in that sense. And I think proximity also matters in terms of these peer relationships or not. I think as multicultural as America and places like America actually are, most interracial, intercultural interactions are not symmetrical. They're usually in a service relationship. The person who serves you at the checkout. It's not, very rarely are these peer relationships or peer interactions. So I think we should think about this question of proximity and the peering in these relationships. I'd also say one more thing, Michael, which is the importance of role models. And this is where it becomes really, really important, because as societies become diverse and multicultural in all these different ways, the absence of role models at the top makes enormous difference. Think about women role models, think about Black role models, think about Latinx role models, people who are succeeding in their fields. That actually makes enormous difference. We hear this all the time in companies. It makes a difference if there's somebody who looks like you at the top. It makes a big difference when there are people who you can interact with and they're truly your peers, as opposed to your juniors or people serving you. These things, I think, matter a great deal.
Boyd, as you think about the question, there you are in the middle of Utah itself, a great state. How do you think these things can be fixed? What do we need to go to as a key principle to include?
Well, as I've been listening to each of you, it's occurred to me that we all tend to be most comfortable when we're surrounded by people who think like we do. So our comfort zone is in similarity. And often when there's difference, that challenges us and it creates some discomfort. So when you think about that in the context of first an organization, I remember a story a friend told me where a senior leader of this global organization came to visit their site. And at the end of the day, he said, "I really enjoyed getting to know your team of one." And he said, "Well, what do you mean? You spent the day with my team of 12 people. He said, "No, you don't have a team of 12 people. You have a team of one, yourself, cloned 12 times. And so that really challenged my friend to examine the lack of diversity in his team. And it wasn't just racial diversity, it was diversity of thinking, background, every possible thing. And he came to realize that it represented a great weakness in his organization. They didn't have the capacity, because of all this sameness, to deal with the complexity of the challenges they were facing. So when you look at that from a societal standpoint, from our community, wherever it might be, we have to recognize that we may feel uncomfortable with differences, but unless we're willing to embrace them and organize ourselves that brings people different than we are into our circle, into how we organize ourselves, we will not have high performance organizations, and we will be subject to these biases that surround us and these weaknesses in society. So I also think that, another thing that we need to be thoughtful of is really being careful about labels. It's so easy to put people in a box, whether it be a racist box or religious box or whatever the orientation. And when we put someone in a box, we stop really listening. And so I think avoiding labels and getting very curious with other people. When someone says something that makes us uncomfortable, rather than start defending ourselves, I think it's vital that we use that trigger of our emotions to just become curious and say, tell me more about what you're thinking. And as they share more, we discover an inroad to sort of break these divides into commonality.
Well, we're in our last couple of minutes. Thank you, Boyd. Thank you, each one of you. We've got just a few minutes left before we sign off. And I'm going to just ask very quickly for each one of our panelists to think about this question. As we're trying to develop understanding of people who are different to us, how do you, in your own personal life, make sure that you can give respect and gain respect from those who are different to you? James.
I often think a lot about, people who think differently than me, and make sure who have I talked to who disagrees with me lately? What have I read that isn't written by an author that I already know? Have I been to a meeting with people that I don't know lately, or will probably disagree with? Have I been to people, for example, right now, I mostly work in the corporate world, but I said, I want to spend time with labor union leaders. I'd like to just understand how they think about these issues. So I think this idea of seeking to learn, seeking to listen, seeking difference as a way to understand, I think is quite important.
Anne? Anne?
Yes. So what I would say is very similar to what James was sharing, which is I seek to actually put myself in uncomfortable positions when I think about this notion of being comfortable versus uncomfortable, and I give the group here an analogy. When we think about physical exercise, right? What's the best kind of exercise for our bodies? It's interval training, because we are looking to stretch ourselves and test our capacity and test how far we can go, but it requires that we also have downtime. And I think about this in the context of the people I spend time with, the kind of media that I consume, the books that I read. And so, I've always got kind of a bunch of different things going on at the same time, to push myself to that level of discomfort. I probably say yes to things that I wouldn't naturally if I was optimizing to a comfortable position, if you will. And it's really intentional, because the pace at which the market is moving now and the pace of change, whether it's triggered by technology or otherwise, really demands that we continue to push ourselves and to expand our minds, and our hearts and our spirits in a way that that all great leaders, I believe, must pursue. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
Thank you. And then Boyd, and then finally Sanda, but short answers. Thank you, Boyd.
I would just say two things. One is I really try to create a rich private life. It's so easy in today's 24-hour news cycles and all the noise that's around us, and our tendency to always turn on the radio or whatever it is. We really really don't have as much quiet as we need in our lives. That allows us to reflect and really examine the gaps in our lives. So one is a rich private life that's quiet and reflective in the hurry. And the second is when I meet people, I've learned to ask the question, tell me your story. It's the first thing I try to do. And when I learn their story and about their mom and dad and their grandparents and what led them to do what they do, I discover so many openings of why I love this person and why I want to learn more and create more with this person.
Sanda.
At a personal level, I'm in a very new chapter. I moved across the world, a new continent, new place of work. And, two things that I'm really reflecting at this point in time is I'm examining my own unconscious biases. Because without that, I really will not be able to embrace everything that this new chapter provides for me. That's the first. And the second, actually, very similar to what Boy said, I'm approaching this new chapter with openness, with readiness to listen, to learn, and to understand. And for that, you need that inner quiet and that inner peace. So I'm trying to master a new role, but I'm also trying to master a new me, because it's a whole new chapter.
Thank you. Well, just to give you a quick response for myself, one of the things that I find one of the most uplifting experiences that I have on a regular basis is to visit with those who are incarcerated and in prison. You come away from that experience constantly overwhelmed with gratitude, but also with the endurance and strength of character so many people behind bars have built up over years and over decades. And they're in this real strength to go constantly without, and often to feel great weight of injustice, but yet to smile and to be grateful to receive others. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to appreciate such radically different lives to my own. So I leave you with a quote as we sign off, thanking this wonderful panel of Anne and Sanda and James and Boyd, which is from John Maxwell, who said, "Leaders become great not because of their power, but because of their ability to empower others." So we hope you've been empowered, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.